allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, we'll commence with roll call.
Here.
Here. Okay, we'll have our report from the Planning Director, EJ.
Good morning. EJ Avaldi with the Planning Services Division. Today's meeting is going to be maybe a little shorter than anticipated. We have two of the items are requesting continuances, and then we will be hearing the event/community centers by George Rosasco. Just looking at upcoming Planning Commission agendas, we have a lot of projects that are moving around, getting ready. Some have environmental documents that have to finish circulation before we get them scheduled for hearing. But right now we're looking at the May 8th Planning Commission hearing being canceled. That's different than when we last talked. So we're going to cancel May 8th, but we'll be back May 22nd. Where we have a number of items, a couple rafting permits, the expo floors, appeal. There's a variance for Lundberg, and there may be one or two more items. And then in June, we talked about going up to Tahoe for a meeting on June 12th. We may still do that. If we don't, it might be pushed out to June 26th. I think either way, we're going to be doing a Tahoe meeting. And there are a number of Tahoe projects that will probably be ready for one of those meetings. The Board of Supervisors, if you don't already know, they had a meeting up in Tahoe this past week, Monday and Tuesday. The board received an update on the Tahoe Community Plan update, and they also approved the contract so they can begin work on the EIR and EIS for that project. The board also received an update on the Cabin Creek Biomass project. And they provided, the board also provided direction to staff regarding the Placer Vineyards Owners Group proposed fiscal impact analysis, which basically is kind of changing the assumptions for all the finance planning as part of that project. I was not up there. I can't give you any more details on that. We did receive an appeal on the Camel's Hump Caretakers Residence, which you guys acted on at the last meeting. That was filed, of course, by the North Fork, or Friends of the North Fork. So that is tentatively scheduled for the board June 17th. And that's all I have. If there's any questions, we'll get going with the meeting.
I guess that's it. Thank you. Okay. At this time, if there's anyone from the public that would like to speak to any issue except anything that we have on today's agenda, now's your chance to speak. Okay, seeing none, we'll go ahead and have to wait a few minutes for some.
See what happened?
Yeah.
You want to sing?
I don't even have any good jokes. I don't even have any bad jokes.
When you can say it to mix public.
Yeah, what can I say? Yeah.
These uncomfortable moments of
Yes.
silence.
Well, not if you You want me to tell a story? I don't know if I have a story. What I can tell you though is back to the Tahoe Community Plan update. You know that the board got they had a pretty lengthy workshop this week. This staff, Crystal Jacobson, will be bringing that hopefully to a June meeting to have a workshop, get you guys up to date on where all that is that. I think the policy document, one of the policy documents is going to be ready for review at that time. So it'd be a good time for a workshop. And I think the last time you were updated was sometime in January, if I'm not mistaken. So it's been a while, so I think June would be a great time to do that as well. And we'll try to do that up at the Tahoe meeting and still get you home before dark.
Problem is I'm going to be gone for that meeting, so.
So
I won't be here.
both dates?
Both dates. Okay, it looks like we can go ahead to item number 1, Rio Bravo wood waste chip and grinding conditional use permit. Alex?
Good morning, Commissioners. Alex Fish, Placer County Planning Services. It's with considerable disappointment that I have to tell you all this morning that I'm requesting your agreement to continue this item to May 22nd, I believe is the identified date. Late yesterday afternoon, it was discovered through conversation with the applicant that the notification posters were not posted out at the project site. I take responsibility for that. That's something that I ordinarily would remind them of at the time that the public notice is circulated, that I remind them to go ahead and make sure they post those up. And just through casual conversation, it was determined that didn't happen. As a consequence, we have not met our legal burden to publicly provide constructive notice to the public of this hearing. And for that reason, staff is requesting your concurrence to continue the item.
Oh.
I do have the applicant here, by the way.
Okay. Rich?
Let me see. I would make the motion that we continue the item to a date certain, May 22nd.
I'll second that.
I have a motion and a second. Should I ask if anybody that's here?
You should at least inquire if the applicant
Yeah.
would want to speak on the continuance.
Yeah, would the applicant have any comment?
And just for the applicant's information, testimony would be only on the issue of continuing the matter.
Dr. Ted Guth here on behalf of Rio Bravo Rockland, and we're fine with the continuance of the, so no comment. Okay.
Oh,
If I may, I think the one request I'd like to make is that we continue it to a time specific so that we don't have to, do we need to recirculate the public notice, do the mail out again?
That's correct.
Okay.
And we do. I think Kathy does have a time that we can assign to this for the May 22nd meeting.
Okay.
So do you want to
10:20?
add that to your?
Yeah, I'll amend my motion to 10:20.
And I'll still second it.
Okay, I have a motion second. Roll call.
Aye.
Yes.
Yes. Motion carries, so be back before us the 22nd, 10:30,
10:20.
or 10:20. I think we keep gaining time.
Well, yeah, we continue things.
It may end up being a month.
Back to that song, Gary.
Yeah.
Yeah, this might be.
June. Then get back July 1st. I'd be gone for a week if you haven't gone over to Kauai.
Oh, okay, 5 minutes. Do you have a 5-minute story?
We should have on hold music or something. So, just listen to the comments about the night deck and then are we going to daylight that today, or did you want to just have it miss till you're cold? We don't have to. Yeah. Just know we're going to daylight it today.
Give a quick overview of what
What's your tie design? What's
Wrong.
Where?
Wrong.
Cool. I love these kind of ties.
Yeah,
Lauren's got his whole battery of them.
Yeah, I got this. I also got this. I was his best man in his wedding. He brought this back to me.
Oh, that's pretty.
That's cool.
Yeah, when they went to get it for me.
Very cool. All right. All right. Well, you know, I wouldn't know if he's, gone into a more conservative.
I was waiting to hear back from Michael after that.
I was talking to Jerry about that this morning, and I was sent just a clarifying email. And he said, Michael popped up with this consult with counsel, but he didn't quite put it in the context of this is a problem, but we can't do much about it. So I'm just going to clarify, especially for, like Mary, because I know Mary's struggling. I don't know what we're going to do with Costa Ranch. It's like, really? What, we're going to, this Macon statements, the county was going to start environmental review on behalf of people.
Well, if you were in conversation,
No, you said not me too. Well, you said, no, I didn't. No. Yeah, it's kind of like if you watching, visualizing a sail on a sailboat, depending on the gust.
right?
Delayed long enough. Okay, we'll go ahead and reconvene our meeting. Roy?
Thank you, Chair Denial. The appellant and applicant, who's one and the same in this case, Expo Floors LLC, represented by Robert A. Laurie, is requesting that the Planning Commission continue its appeal of the zoning administrator's denial of this project, and the request would be to continue to the May 22nd Planning Commission hearing and for a time certain of 10:35 a.m. And also attached with the memo is additional information from Robert A. Laurie, the number one legal counsel for the appellant applicant regarding a scheduling conflict.
Okay, anybody entertain a motion since the applicant's not here?
I'll make a motion that we continue this to May 22nd at 10:35 a.m.
Have a motion.
Excuse me, you might want to check to see if the applicant appellant would like to make any statements on the record or any other members of the public regarding the request to continue only.
I would. Thank you. My name is Peter Galgani. I represent Gene Satrap, who's a neighbor of Expo Floors, and we're not opposing the continuance, but we're hoping for clarity as far as Expo Floors had 30 days from the date of appeal to submit additional materials and so forth. They didn't do that, and we just want to make sure that that window is closed, and simply because the hearing date's been continued, that doesn't reopen time for them to submit additional materials.
I believe this was already clarified to the individual speaking, but let me clarify it for the Planning Commission. There is a requirement or a provision in our appeal code that states that an appellant can submit additional materials to be considered during the appeal hearing within 30 days of the date of filing of the appeal. In this instance, that time has run. I don't know if any materials have been submitted, but in essence, the time has run to submit additional materials for the appeal. I would note, however, that the Planning Commission, when it takes up this appeal, will be taking up all evidence presented to it during the appeal hearing, as it does with every one of these appeals. I hope that clarifies the matter.
Yeah, so that means maybe he doesn't give anything to planning, but if he gets up here and speaks to us, anything that he brings new, is putting into evidence. So.
Okay, well, I appreciate that clarification. And hopefully if he puts in something dramatic, then we'll be provided an opportunity to respond to it. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is anybody else out there not talking about the merit of it, just the continued?
My name is Andrewgisborg. I'm applicant for Expo Flooring. I just want to submit this document. The reason why we want to continue this because they have a military service. And
yeah, we have anything that any of the paperwork that you have in.
yeah, just want to make sure that you guys receive all this copy. The reason. So thank you. That's
okay. Thank you.
Second one back there.
Okay, go ahead. Come on.
I'm Dr. Gloria Freeman. I'm on Moss Lane, also Granite Bay. This parcel has a history of issues with it.
Okay.
And I just wanted to point out that I support the zoning administrator's decision, in case I don't make it to the next meeting.
Okay. Okay, seeing no one, we'll go ahead and come back.
We got a motion.
Yeah, we got a motion and a second, so roll call.
Nader. Mr. Moss?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Ricucci? Yes. Mr. Denio?
Yes. Okay, so that will come back May 22nd, 10:35. And let's see. 10:20, so we're on to our workshop, community centers. George?
Good morning, George Rosasco, Placer County Planning. I am here on the 5th workshop on event centers. You recall at our 4th workshop that you were happy with the draft ordinance as presented and that you wanted it to go out to the MACs and get any comments that the MACs might have on it. Specifically, you asked me to solicit at the MACs 4 questions. One was the number of allowed events in an event center, find out how they felt about that in the ordinance, ensure that event centers in agriculturally zoned districts do not displace agricultural use. They had any ideas about how to do that. How did they feel about the noise regulations that were in the draft ordinance at this time? And then the other issue that I was asked to bring to the MACs was permanent information posting at all event centers. So I went to the MACs, lots. I went to all the MACs at least twice. Some of them I went to 3 times. Some of them I went to 4. So what I brought back to you in your staff report, I have put a synopsis of what every MAC submitted. I also attached to your staff report, every MAC that I went to submitted a letter. So that was attached to your staff report. And then what I did, I kind of boiled all that down to what I saw as the main points that the MACs had. And they were these points. An agricultural event center should be required to demonstrate to Placer County Agricultural Commission that they have an on-site agricultural production of $1,000 gross per acre per year. Okay, that was in direct. There was a lot of different versions of how to go about preserving the ag. That is a direct recommendation from the Agricultural Commission that they thought that was appropriate, that if someone was doing that they were actually an agricultural producer and that an event center would be an alternative revenue stream. The second thing from the Agricultural Commission was no agricultural event center, building, or component shall occur within current agricultural production areas on parcels designated as prime farmland, farmland of statewide importance, farmland of local importance, or unique farmland by the Department of Conservation. Another good point. If you're gonna actually be a farmer and have an alternative revenue stream, don't put the event center on your best land. Common sense. Agricultural event centers shall not be protected by the Placer County right to farm ordinance. Okay, this is an interesting one. I had not occurred to me. We have a right to farm ordinance in this county, which basically stipulates that if you're in a farm zone, expect that there's going to be farming going on, and it's protected by this ordinance. So people who move in who aren't farmers that are next to a farm are expected to maybe accept things, smells, odors, noises during all times of the day, large rice pumps going 24/7 during rice growing season. So that's what that ordinance is designed to do. What the Agricultural Commission wanted clarified, and I think what they meant by this was that that ordinance should not be used to protect an agricultural event center. It is not a farming, it's not a component of farming that should be protected under that ordinance. At least that was my understanding. And then the next ones are general comments that I sort of boiled down from all the MACs. A lot of the MACs had concerns about the minimum acreage for agricultural event centers. A lot of the MACs recommended that the actual agricultural event center size should be doubled. So a small would go from 10 to 20, an intermediate from 20 to 40, and a large from 40 to 80. The other main theme was the suggested or proposed number of events permitted each year should be reduced. There's a widely varying degree of reduction there. The next one that you've all heard a lot, code enforcement should be available on weekends to deal with event center issues. That's something that when we've talked about it at the Planning Commission before, that it was something that the commission did not think was best to be codified. We do have tools available to us to do code enforcement. The Board of Supervisors has actually asked us to put in budget requests for more code enforcement officers so that we will be able to respond much more quickly and much more effectively. If there is a problem going on weekends, we could make people available on weekends to go out and deal with those things. I'm not sure if we'll actually have someone in the office working like a regular work day, but we could definitely have someone on call. So if something is getting really out of hand, you'd make a call, that officer would go out and investigate. This was the one that we never really talked about, and it came out of the max, and it's a very good point. Define how long an event can be and what constitutes an event. It's a very good question. We did not define that when I left here. I have come up with some ideas. I went back and reviewed some information. I listened to what people had to say, some of my background information, and I actually came up with some language which I think addresses what an event would be. An event, excuse me, I need to take a drink of water. An event, for the purpose of the Event Center Ordinance, would be a gathering of more than 5 people for 1 to 12 hours where the purpose is for fundraising, profit, or is political, public, social, or educational in nature. So that means if there's more than 5 people that go to an event center to have a party, that is going to be considered an event. Now, the reason for the 1 to 12 hours is that I figure if you're going to be there for more than an hour, it's probably an event. And most of these events, based on the times and the regulations and the current ordinance, none of these would go past 12 hours. So one event could not exceed 12 hours. Now, I had to put in a disclaimer because, as you know, sometimes it comes up that event center owners are like, well, what happens if I have, my daughter's wedding here? Does that count as an event? Well, I address it in the second part of the definition by saying, a gathering which consists of friends or family of an event center owner that is not for the purpose of fundraising, profit, or is political, public, or educational in nature, and this is the important part, and no donation or compensation of any kind is exchanged in relationship to the gathering, is not considered an event. Now, I will tell you some of the issues, and the reason I have the compensation clause in there is because there is what appears to be operating as an event center, and the reason they have put forward to us that it's not an event center is because they allow friends, members of their church to use it. However, there is a fairly substantial donation fee required back for that use. So their position is, it's not an event center, we're not doing it for profit, we lend it out to our friends, and they make a donation back to us. So what I'm hoping for today is that I can get direction on these issues and anything else that you might think needs to be included or subtracted from the ordinance. And then what will happen is I will go back and I will modify this ordinance. I will bring it back to you for a recommendation. We do currently have the negative declaration circulating for the draft ordinance. We believe that there was a defect in the noticing, so what we're going to do is we're going to go back and fix that defect. We're going to see what comments we get on it, and then we will recirculate it for another 30 days before we come back to you. So essentially, the environmental document will be out for about 60 days. Also, probably when we recirculate it, depending on what comes out of this hearing and how we change the ordinance, we will probably modify it slightly to reflect any changes that we make. So with that, I think it pretty much sums it up, unless you have any questions for me. Yes.
Let me see. Seems like there was some comments that talked about now when somebody gets approval to have an event center.
Yes.
the approval goes in the zoning ordinance with the land to
Yes.
the next owner. There were several MAC comments where they were saying, well, make it to the individual, but not with the land. And I guess I don't see it on the list here, so I
Yeah,
guess there's been
it's not legal.
information.
You can't do that. You can't issue a conditional use permit to a person. Conditional use permits run with the land. If you issued it to the person, for instance, if that person moved to a different site, do they carry that use permit with them and open an event center at a different site? I can't give you the legal basis, but I've talked to county council about it. It's not a legal way to go about doing it. If you were interested in having some kind of stop on a use permit when that person leaves, I think what you would say is, as long as this person owns this property, this use permit runs with the land. I think you could do this. Could you say, if that person sells that property, this use permit is no longer, no, that's not legal either? No, it's not legal. So once you get the use permit, it runs with the land unless it falls into our non-use clause in our zoning ordinance where it stops for a period of time, and then that use permit is no longer good. They have to reapply.
If I'm not mistaken, George, isn't there something in the ordinance that says if the event center ceases to
Yeah.
operate or?
That's what I just mentioned that. It's that period of time. I think it's either a year. I think it's a year.
A year, 1 year.
If it ceases to be used for a year, then that use permit is no longer valid, and they would have to go through the process again.
And this is established in state law. Use permits and variances run with the land. They do not run with an individual applicant.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? I have one just sort of with the list that you have, George. Maybe each of those bullet points, you sort of went over a little bit what they were, and you, let's see, on the first one, my question is, it's $1,000 gross per acre per year. When you talk about that, and maybe just for everybody's benefit, is it on the total acreage of a farm? In other words, you can have a farm that has 80 acres, but 20 acres of it are the residence and barn and stuff, and there's, 30 acres of actual crop production. Is it on just crop production?
No, my understanding from the Ag Commission was that their thought was that if you were actively in agricultural on your property, that was a reasonable number across the entire acreage. That was my understanding.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, maybe just follow up on that one, just with a thought or a question. Now, this says $1,000 gross per acre per year. So
Right.
does that mean that there's going to be some kind of an annual reporting process that the Ag Commissioner is going to be requesting?
I don't think that we have gotten to the point where you would actually go out and monitor these every year. I think it would be more of an issue, for instance, if you came in and you were an event center and you were predicating your $1,000 a year based on, let's say, you grew mandarins. There has to be some reasonableness. There might be a freeze. You might not make $1,000 per year because the crop didn't come in. Okay, but the trees are still there, and it's going to come back. So that's not something that we would say, you can't have events this year because you lost most of your crop. Would be more of a scenario is if it came to our attention that you bulldozed your entire orchard out and you really didn't have an ongoing agricultural use. That's when we would say, you're no longer able to do an agricultural event center because you don't have the agricultural component. Are we going to actively police it every year and go out and check all of these things? Probably not. It would be something that if we heard about it or became aware about it or received a complaint about it, then we would go out.
Okay, that answers that part. Is this, when they are making an application,
Yes.
how do they establish the $1,000 per acre per year?
What we would do is when you came in for the conditional use permit for an agricultural event center, we would forward that to the agricultural commissioner with a request that he verify that this individual is producing $1,000 per acre per year. I've had conversations with the agricultural commissioner about this. He is definitely willing to do this. He is of the opinion that if you were making this level of income, he is probably already familiar with your operation and that sort of thing. So he was very willing to do that, to ensure that that agricultural component moves forward.
Okay. Thank you.
The question comes up, though, if somebody's going to plant let's say a new vineyard, it'll take several years. So will this condition be negated, or how would that be addressed?
Well, no, that's an interesting question, and that's a policy issue that I would ask the commission to give us direction on. You could do it two different ways. You could simply hold it to when you get an agricultural event center, you are making $1,000 per year per acre, or you could say something to the effect of, or have the potential to make $1,000 per year per acre in a specified amount of time. I would normally defer that to the agricultural commissioner. For instance, if someone's put in a 20-acre vineyard and they're just sprouting up, you know, it's probably reasonable to assume that in a couple years, or, well, I don't know much about agriculture, so bear with me, in a certain amount of time that those vines will start producing and they will create that $1,000 gross per year. So you could put language in that says, or the potential to create that. I don't think you want to go onto a piece of property and have someone say, here's where I'm going to put the vineyard, and it's going to be 10 acres, and it will produce this much money, and not have anything there except it be like an old cow pasture. I don't think you want to take it back that far, but clearly if someone has shown the intent of putting in those mandarins or putting in those grapes, I think there could definitely be an allowance at that point. But that's a policy question for you as a commission to answer.
Okay. On item bullet point 2, for prime farmland, statewide importance, farmland of local importance, unique farmland.
Yeah.
I think by Department of Conservation, is that on all those, or is there would be the controlling agency for determination of that for all those, or
I believe we
some of those
actually
going to be county?
No, I believe, again, I would defer to the Ag Commissioner, but my understanding is that these pieces of property are already well known. Like if we have prime farmland, we know where it's at. The Ag Commissioner knows where there's prime farmland.
So that would be something that would probably come in the final package. So
it would be during the development or the, not pre-development, but during the review period of a conditional use permit. That would also go to the Ag Commissioner, and he would let us know if that unique or prime farmland existed, where their structures were going to be. So by the time we get to the Planning Commission, these questions would be answered. It's not on unique or prime farmland.
The other place that this comes up is in the initial study. There's a specific question that asks if there are any soils in these categories. So it is also looked at that point of environmental review for any application.
Oh, okay. That pretty well answers my question on that.
You see on the bullet point that talks about private roads, I know this has been a significant issue in all the MAC meetings. But I guess
I would say I was surprised. I would say the most argued about issue was roads. The MAC, about private access and how do you address that. And there was a lot of discussion at all the MACs about whether these should be allowed on shared roads with other individuals, or whether they should only be accessed by their own individual road out to a publicly maintained road. There was a lot of discussion and a lot of debate about that. The biggest concern that came up when you put things on a shared private road with other individuals is who's going to maintain it. That's something that could be addressed through the conditional use permit. But another interesting question that came up was liability. So you all share a road, and someone is using that to access their event center, and someone crashes on that road. The liability of that was something that people were concerned about.
I guess another kind of question that I would have, or just want to know an answer to, is if somebody has an unrestricted easement
Yes.
on a private road that other people share, then can the county say, well, no private roads? If somebody, it's like having your own road.
You mean if your property is accessed by a shared private road, and there is no restriction upon that use, it's for the benefit of that piece of property for anything that property is allowed to do.
It would be an easement which was the same as your road.
Can the county say that it's not appropriate to use that for an agricultural event center? Is that what you're asking me? Yes.
I think that's what this is saying, but I'm just wondering if you have an easement.
I think as part of the ordinance, we could require, if the planning commission chooses to only have these accessed via their own road out to a publicly maintained road. We have the ability to do that. Whether you choose to do that or not is a policy issue that would, again, be up to the commission.
Yeah. My question was if we have the ability, if the ability exists to.
I believe that you. Yes,
that.
I believe that you do. Any other questions?
Just one. I see nothing there about what happens if you violate the policies that we set.
What happens if you violate, like if you're not in compliance with the zoning ordinance provisions, that whatever we adopt?
Your noise limit is above what it should be, or that you have more cars parked there than you should be, or anything like that.
Then we would, if we received a complaint about that, and we would require that it be a written complaint, then we would start going through the code enforcement process.
What's the disciplinary action for this?
It could be one of several. If you started through the code enforcement process, which is very well defined, you start with a letter, and then you go to a notice of violation if they actually did that sort of thing. The first thing, if they said, I didn't realize I extended it, it won't happen again, it probably stops there. We could ultimately, if someone, it was a violation of the ordinance, you could take it all the way to the point of, you could give them an administrative citation where they could be fined $100, $500, or $1,000 per day per violation. There's that remedy. You could go through a judicial citation process where you actually cite them and they wind up in court and they explain it to a judge. We could, and it's probably the most effective method at this point, and we've talked about this on numerous occasions, that if someone violates this and you talk to them and they say they'll never do that again, it probably stops there. If it happens a second time, I think we write a staff report and we come back in front of you and we have a discussion about revocation of their use permit. I think that's the most effective method at our disposal, and we have that right now. And I think when we've talked about this in the past, you as a commission voiced a willingness that the bar should be relatively low for these, that if they are not complying with their conditions, that you would like staff to bring those back to you and you would like to consider revoking them.
One more question.
Yes.
Just for clarification, if somebody under the existing ordinance has a community center approval, conditional use permit, and this comes into play, will they have to reapply?
You mean if you revoke it?
Huh?
What? I'm sorry?
No.
How did I say that wrong, or no?
I don't understand the question.
Okay, so there undoubtedly are several existing community center permits that exist. And so when this one is completed, does that mean that people need to come back and reapply?
No.
Okay.
Those have a non-conforming right, and I'm not even going to say it's non-conforming. They have a right to continue under the provisions under which they were first approved. The only time that they might become subject to the new provisions if they came in for an expansion or some other kind of modification. We might have to look at those existing event centers in relationship to the new ordinances that were put into to place. But as long as they're operating within the original provisions under which they were approved, they're free to continue to do so.
Okay.
Without any involvement from the county.
Okay, thank you.
The only other way they might come under the new ordinance is, say, for example, they had a use permit that was granted, but they didn't exercise the use permit within the period of time defined in the permit to do so that their permit expires, then they would be subject to the new one.
Okay. Of course, then they would have never been an event center because they didn't exercise their permit. So, gentlemen, any other questions?
I think that pretty well answers.
I'll be here for the duration if anything comes
all
up.
the questions, at least on those bullet points.
So what I'm hoping to leave here today with, definitive direction about anything that you would like changed in this so that when I come back, the next time I come back, it will be with the circulated environmental document for your recommendation on the environmental document and the draft ordinance to the Board of Supervisors so the Board of Supervisors can take whatever action they deem appropriate. So I'm hoping to get direction on if you want these things added or subtracted or anything done to the ordinance or anything else that you would like to see put into the ordinance today. So when I come back, we don't have a 6th workshop. We actually have a hearing for the recommendation on the draft ordinance. Okay?
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone from the public now, this is your time to come up and speak. Just come up, state your name, and let us know your thoughts.
Good morning. Marilyn Jasper, Sierra Club Public Interest Coalition. George has assuaged a lot of concerns. We've appreciated these workshops, and we have acted, we feel, in good faith, as we think you have and we think staff has. But we were truly disappointed with the neg deck that the zoning text amendment presented in there was identical to what first came out, what we thought was a conceptual draft proposal, and we thought you were going to take all the input, all the recommendations, I know that's a huge task and you've seen it in your staff report, and sort of condense them, and then they would go into this proposed ZTA, be circulated with the neg deck for comments. So up until today, with George's presentation with somewhat new directions and possibly a new circulation, I feel a little better about this process, and I hope the neg deck to us was circulated prematurely with no changes. It was just like whatever we got in October, that's what the ZTA came out. And so probably a mistake in understanding on our part, but I think it may be remedied. So at this point, we can't stress strongly enough or request strongly enough that you consider some of the wonderful, George's, these recommendations, and maybe if you have a chance to look at some of the recommendations that the MACs and the Ag Commission and other citizens submitted. We don't agree with all of them, but there are some really insightful concerns and recommendations. And last, of all the suggestions that we appreciated, there's one in particular that can't stress enough, and that's performance standards with guaranteed code enforcement. If the ZTA is not created with enforcement criteria, it's useless, and it creates a scofflaw mentality which just exacerbates the problems. almost 1 year ago when that first staff report came out, it stated the advantage of performance criteria as guaranteeing standards will be maintained. That was the advantage. The disadvantage was stated as it's restricting of discretion. But we would like to point out that that's what got us into this mess. The discretion of the community centers is why we've spent almost 2 years on this. So we would urge that you go with the changes and have a proposed zoning text amendment that ensures enforceable standards, and then do the neg deck. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Susan Ames. I'm at the corner of Wise and Gold Hill. And one thing that came up just right now that caught my attention was the idea of being approved for an event center when you just planted your 2 acres of grapes or your mandarins or whatever. I think we've lost sight of the fact that this whole issue came up because it was supposed to be a vehicle for promoting your agricultural product. If you don't have an agricultural product yet, if you don't have your mandarins, if you don't have your wine, you have nothing to promote. And while I can see the benefit of having an event center to introduce your product to people, I think that letting people have events for strictly to make money, which is what that would be, is a little bit premature. So I would ask that you kind of think that over before you approve that. On that note, I love the fact that so many of the MACs have come up with the same concerns. We talked about this Monday night at the MAC meeting, and I would just urge that you take baby steps. It's really a lot easier to expand the permission for a bigger event center, or if we start out small and there's no problems. But if you start out big, you end up with problems, and it's very hard to dial it back and tell people, no, you can't have 200 people, you can only have 100 now. So with that in mind, just baby steps, I think, would be the best way to approach this. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Dan Macon, and I am a commercial sheep operator here in Auburn and also the livestock representative to the Agricultural Commission. And if I could expand and maybe explain some of our issues with this, hopefully expand on what George presented this morning. I think our first and foremost concern is that these event centers must exist in support of credible commercial agriculture and not vice versa. That there has to be commercial agriculture on the property that these event centers support rather than an event center with 4 apple trees, for example. And I think that was one of our primary concerns. I do have a question perhaps for George to clarify with respect to what is defined as an event. And this was a question that came up in the Ag Commission. We would hope that this program continues to differentiate between events that happen on farms, like sheepdog trials or farm tours, from the physical building and alteration of the property that would exist with an event center. And I don't know if that definition that George presented as an idea continues to make that differentiation or not, but I would encourage some consideration there. With respect to the income requirements, I think the Ag Commission had a couple of thoughts. One was that this would work similar to Williamson Act consideration, where the Ag Commissioner and perhaps the UC Cooperative Extension Farm Advisor would make a determination about the income associated with the agricultural enterprise. Our intent was that it represent the entire acreage rather than just that acreage under cultivation. So if it's a 30-acre property, it would need to generate $30,000 worth of income, or gross income on an annual basis. We also felt like there should be some mechanism if property is not used for agriculture in the future for code enforcement to make some determination with the Agricultural Commissioner's assistance. Would not require an annual reporting on the part of the property owner, but if all the trees disappeared, for example, there would be some mechanism for considering that. I guess our perspective on potential production may be a bit different in that if you've invested the $50,000 or $60,000 an acre in vineyard development with no prospect of income for several years, that maybe that's a way to help cash flow an otherwise difficult situation. But again, we felt like a determination by the agricultural commissioner and the farm advisor would help address those community concerns as well. And I think you've heard both sides of that issue today. I guess the other issue that I wanted to address just briefly is the right to farm issue. And to use a personal experience, when we wean our lambs, it's rather noisy for our neighbors for a day or two. And all our neighbors understand that, and if there is an issue, code enforcement understands that that's part of the right to farm ordinance on our property as well. We would hate to have that jeopardized by somebody utilizing the right to farm ordinance to justify a loud event after hours at an agricultural event center. And we just wanted to make some clarification with respect to that. And I guess the last thing that the Ag Commission felt was perhaps an important aspect of all of this and could be of use to the Planning Commission as well is for these applications to come before the Agricultural Commission, just as a Williamson Act application comes before our commission, so that we have some agricultural input that would help inform your decisions on those issues as well. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
I did have one question. When you were talking about your sheep and doing, say, I guess, are you exempting it as an event if you were, having people over and running your dogs, just to show them what they can do with the sheep?
As I understand the current system, and I helped start the Placer Farm and Barn Tour a number of years ago. For an event of that nature, there is a minor use permit process, I believe, that we had to go through to make sure that we had safe access to the property and that we were addressing other issues, fire-related and so forth. That process, in my mind, would stay in place. I would not, in my example, want to have to get a conditional use permit to have one sheepdog trial on a property that didn't involve a building, permanent parking structures, those types of things. I think there's some differential there in my mind.
Yeah. I think there is, because if they're just doing one trial.
Yeah. Here's the thing, like the Farm and Barn Tour, that's an industry-wide event, and that's usually handled by the Ag Commissioner making application for a temporary outdoor event permit. A sheepdog trial on a piece of property, if you're going to have 100 people, the way you would normally go about doing that is just get a temporary outdoor event permit. Anyone can come in and apply for 2 a year. So that would probably be how that would be handled.
If somebody's doing a sheepdog trial 24 times a year, they probably do need to go through this process.
Yeah, I would agree.
I would think so. Okay.
See, I might have a couple questions here. I guess the two things I'm thinking about are the prime agricultural soils, as well as the $1,000 per acre per year. And just off the top of my head, thinking through the Placer County where we have the prime agricultural soils, there's really not a whole lot of it.
Right.
But maybe a place where there's the most is in Forest Hill. And so at any rate, that would pretty well eliminate the opportunity of an event center in Forest Hill.
Well, and maybe there's some balance to strike there. I think our desire as the Ag Commission was to conserve what is a pretty precious resource and kind of the foundation of all of our agricultural activities. I think with respect to forest soils, there may be some sort of different consideration to make, especially relative to prime. The reason that we did include farmland of local importance is that is a designation that the county can make to the California Department of Conservation. So it does allow the county to designate particular soils that may not rise to the quality of prime by the state's definition as important resources. But perhaps there is some way to address that issue with respect to some of the forest soils.
Okay, and then, yeah, of course, $1,000 an acre may impact the forest area too.
We felt pretty strongly about that issue from a cultivated ag or livestock ag standpoint. For example, with the current cattle market, under the definition that's in the existing zoning text amendment, I could sell 3 steers and be considered a viable agricultural enterprise by the definition of the zoning text amendment. Now, somebody that's raising 3 head of cattle a year certainly is involved in some sort of agricultural production, but it's not a commercial enterprise by the standards that the Ag Commission has set for itself. So I think that was the issue we were trying to address. I think
you said 3, but not 3. I guess I kind of missed that.
3 steers under the existing zoning text amendment of requirement of $4,500 in annual production to qualify. I could sell 3 steers and meet that annual production standard.
So you wanted more.
We felt like we needed to hold these to a higher bar to make sure that the ag use was the primary use of the land rather than the event center.
And so the $1,000, and you took into account what kind of agriculture you like, if you row crops or
row crops, orchards, livestock, vineyards. I would think that if we're talking forest land, it's not going to be required that you've harvested $1,000 per acre in timber, but there would be some requirement to show that the standing inventory of timber on a property would generate commercial level income.
Yeah, you'd probably need more than 10, 20, or 40 acres.
Right.
So
well, and in our mind, you'd need more than 10 acres to be a commercial forestry operation.
Yeah.
Too.
And so, in this criteria, $10,000 would be the 10-acre person.
Correct.
And is the Ag Commission's feeling that that's enough acreage, say, for cows to...
I don't think we'd have, you may have somebody that had 10 acres of irrigated pasture that could demonstrate $10,000 income off of that pasture by running cows. What we wanted to, in our understanding, the smaller parcels are typically used for cultivated agriculture in order to generate that kind of return. 10 acres of rangeland, unirrigated rangeland, will barely support 1 cow for a year. And so we felt like the production ramifications of that income requirement would address what's produced on the smaller parcels versus the larger parcels.
So with a 40-acre parcel, would they be able to produce 40,000?
Not if it was rangeland agriculture, no. Probably.
So probably the cattle part of it would drop off?
Unless it was irrigated pasture, or portions of it were irrigated.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Teresa Cheney, and I live in Newcastle, Gold Hill and Schindler. I wanted to very, very much thank George because he's just been awesome. This is a jewel that you have here. And so it helps me to underscore how much effort, good faith effort from very reasonable, intelligent people that have been coming together for 2 years and have really brought together some pertinent points with trying to strike that balance where the decision is made to take a look at bringing basically a commercial business into a rural agricultural area. I think that there's been a lot of intelligent, reasonable concern expressed and some solutions for a nice balance in that. And I really appreciate the sentiments of the fellow who just spoke from the Agricultural Commission and want to support those. I also want to, with that, say that I want to, what Marilyn had spoke about, making sure to please consider the input that's been brought to all of this and address those individual items so that we don't see things like the negative declaration just being pretty much unaltered. I think that's only just in terms of to reflect the amount of effort that's been put toward this on everybody's part, the county, everybody. I also wanted to make a little note that there was a lot of discussion about sort of like costs and price and for different types of land and what could you expect as a return. And I can see where this is a complex issue in a sense. I totally love the fact that the Agricultural Commission is coming out very strongly that the agriculture should drive the business and not the event center. And so I'm very pleased and I very much support that these applications should go to them before they are allowed or permitted. One thing that occurred to me is with this $1,000 per gross per acre per year, I'm not in the best position to make judgment on that, as this fellow has some really good sense about it, but it worries me whenever we start to put into basically law or code a dollar amount when everything from inflation to economy to whatever can change that dollar amount to be very, very ineffectual. A little bit, we have some different things. We have timberlands, we have rangelands, we have mandarin, small orchard lands, and I think we might want to think about, and gross per acre per year, it just seems like there's a lot of wiggle room that over time that $1,000 could be, you know, you know what I mean? So I kind of feel as though we might want to look at a ratio. And I'm not saying it's the answer. I just think it might be something to consider, that maybe instead of a dollar amount per acre per year, that we look at a ratio of, say, 60% of their gross income comes from their agricultural endeavor rather than the event center endeavor, so that we maintain this agriculture of this rural residential area driving, and that this is supplemental to help people, because I agree with the Agricultural Commission. These folks need to have other businesses and other revenue coming in to be able to sustain small agriculture. It's just, it's got to happen. But let's make sure that we don't have it lopsided. And let's make sure that the event centers aren't driving the commercial profits and the commercial, because that's going to shift everything. That's going to, even the best laid plans with the best laid code and the best laid enforcement, the best follow through, it's going to become upside down, much like the issue of if my sheep are baying, next do we have these cabins that are across the street from me due to the Gold Hill Gardens permit. If my goats are baying into the middle of the night, and I keep the cabin rentees awake, now is my agricultural endeavor now subject to some sort of complaint? Because you just need to look at the effects of when, if the commercial endeavor starts to drive the profits, then it stands to tweak the goose that laid the golden egg, basically the beautiful, rich agricultural resource we have here in Placer County. So I just hope that you guys think a little bit about whatever measures that you take and consider and evaluate, that you keep that first and foremost. Thank you.
Good morning. George Alves, 630 Fowler Road. I'm also the chair of the Lincoln MAC. We've already given George lots of accolades, and he deserves those. Not only is he showing up at these MAC meetings, by my count, 9 MAC meetings, multiple times, not just by request, but actually coming out and helping us along the way on his own. So thank you, George. Just a couple of quick items. Looking at the enhancements, George's list here is inclusive of those 9 different letters that you've received from the MACs. You all have those in front of you. A couple of items I'd like to just point out, or additional comments on, are first the roads. And as George pointed out, that's the biggest contingent item of all the discussions that we've had at the MAC meetings. Even before this ordinance, when we talked about the winery ordinance and others, which that was always the big deal. Currently, with some of the breweries going on, again, that's the other item where there's a lot of contention between those landowners of dealing with that specific road. So having a dedicated road for your event center is, I think, one of the more mandatory items. It eliminates that. The second item was the, sorry, got lost here. Anyway, I'll just jump into the other ones. This list is inclusive of those other items. 2 items that pointed out in the MAC list itself were, and it was just talked about, we looked at 51% of a revenue stream. So that might be an aggressive number, but again, it takes into account for all any inflation or any other items that come up. So we would be pleased with $1,000 but per acre, but coming up with some other number that accounts for the future would also be a good thing. One item that's not on here is that we included in our MAC recommendation was to look at avoiding a concentration of these event centers in a location. So some means of identifying what's going on in a specific community. We want to make sure that these are spread out, that we don't have this large concentration burdening one particular area within the county. That's all I really have. We really support what George has done, and we'd ask you to look at these recommendations and some of the comments I've just made and include those in the next revision. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi there. I'm Kathy Johnson at 600 Wise. We are the brewery owner out on Wise Road. There's been a lot of mention about the road and a shared private road when we're not an event center nor have any intention of being a community center. We're just a small agriculture business growing our own hops for our brewery. The shared road seems to be a very contentious issue. I know you had mentioned about if you have a valid easement with very clearly spelled out as your land rights, that you have public and private access, which we do have. We bore the full burden of the cost of bringing it up the road up to CAL FIRE safety standards, which it was not for the commercial use, but for the residents, because there's 2 private residences that share the road. We bore the burden of that cost. The other owners of the road or of the property are actually operating an illegal trucking company, and they drive their big rigs and logging trucks up and down this road all the time. And they do not, and have not for the past 3 years, contributed to any of the upkeep of the road. So they're in actually violation of their road maintenance agreement as well. So there's a lot of misinformation about shared private roads and the use of them from a legal operating business. So I just wanted to...
I do have one question for you, because it's come up in our discussions here that if your parcel is on a shared road, that you want an event center, that you'd have to have direct access from your parcel to a public road. Do you have that ability on your property?
As ours, we do not. We have NID. We're surrounded by NID.
Okay, because that was one question I have for staff, because I know there's a lot of parcels. If somebody subdivided a parcel and there's a public road, if you're the third parcel in and everything's developed around you, so you don't have any, access.
Correct.
I guess that's something we'd have to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, our parcel was the original parcel, and the other we're the anchor parcel, so we're 11.5 acres, and the other parcels are under 5 acres, and they have the easement supersedes their property. So, yeah. So we don't have any other way in.
Yeah,
there's no other way without moving NID canals and whatnot, and ponds and everything. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to clarify something, and I don't want to detract much from the workshop, but just to clarify the issue of access. What we're talking about here is a public county-maintained road. It's pretty clear that it is county-maintained, public has full access to the roads. What has happened, and what I suspect the MACs have identified, is the fact that having private access onto a road by virtue of having a parcel is different from whether the Planning Commission would consider an additional use that would use that private road and what the impacts to that private road would be. So I want to make sure we're clear that we're not talking about a situation of a property owner saying, well, I have no other access. Well, from the standpoint of whether they can have access to that parcel is a completely separate body of law as to whether they could build on that parcel and drive to and from that parcel. What we're talking about here is whether an event center should be allowed with an access that is private and shared by other property owners. There are several reasons why that consideration has been forwarded to you. One is, in many cases, private roads are not developed to the width that a county-maintained public road are built to or required to be built to. 2, liability. Generally speaking, on a private road, the property owners adjacent to that road own to the center line of the road. Therefore, they are the fee owners. I really don't want to go into more of a discussion about property insurance, but anybody who has property insurance understands that you're insuring your property against liability from injury and damage. And that is the general law with private roads. Third, what we often hear, and it does become problematic for the county, is a use goes in and we hear from the other property owners of private road, well, we didn't agree to this. That's also a separate body of law, because generally speaking, these private roads and who has access onto them are either defined under their parcel maps or they're defined through easement documents. Those don't involve the county. But the minute the county is looking at a new use, the consideration in front of this commission is that new use going to impact the circulation on that road? Not who owns it, who permitted it, but what is the impact, the physical or community impacts of using a private road versus one that's got a driveway onto a public road. So I just want to make sure that we're clear as to what that issue is about.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carol Rubin. I also live in Newcastle. I represent Safe Placer Farmlands. And since this private road access issue has come up, I want to say that the points raised by County Council and by Ms. Johnson, the amount of contention and just rancor that results from these kinds of commercial uses on shared private roads are really the indication why the county really shouldn't be getting involved in this and just say no access from shared private roads. Now, we're already considering in this draft ZTA limitations on the kind of parcel that could have an event center. It has to have minimum size requirements. It has to have minimum setbacks, for instance. The access can be just another minimum requirement for an event center. I also wanted to add my acknowledgement and thanks to the hard work that everyone has done on this issue, particularly Mr. Rosasco. I wanted to say I had submitted a proposed definition for an event, which I thought was something that was lacking. Mr. Rosasco's is much better than the one that I had submitted by email. I think there needs to be one sentence added to Mr. Rosasco's proposed definition, and that is to say that events, as defined under his definition, may only be held at a permitted event center or under the temporary outdoor event ordinance. And I want to echo what Mr. Macon said about agricultural producers. Things like sheep trials, like a mandarin harvest festival, a strawberry growers, picking day or something. Let's think about, I hope you'll consider asking planning to maybe revise slightly the temporary outdoor event ordinance. One, to increase the number of events by a small amount, say from 2 to 6 per year, to help out agricultural producers and allow them to hold more of these temporary outdoor events, and so that there won't be this incentive to build big permanent event facilities on agricultural land. I think that's something that pretty much none of us want. Well, let's make it easier then to hold a few more temporary events during the year. And also, let's streamline that permitting process. The permitting process now is kind of nuts. You have to actually go down before each event to the county, to this building. And why not? Let's do it online. And let's make, if somebody knows they want to have 6 sheepdog trials throughout the year, he can file one request and say, I want to have 6 sheepdog trials roughly in these months. And then call up and say, okay, I'm getting ready to have trial number 3 on May 4th. And it would seem to me that that would be a win-win for pretty much everybody. And I want to thank you all again. I hope that you'll consider these recommendations that have been made carefully, because a lot of thought and hard work, of course, has gone into it. Thanks again.
Good morning. My name's Don DuPont. I'm actually here representing Rock Hill Winery. And to my knowledge, I think, and I can ask George this, I think I'm the only paid applicant, and perhaps probably caused a lot of this grief. I think that's the case, right? I'm the only paid fee applicant for a use permit for a MUP? No? Well, yeah, but he's already approved. Yes. And frankly, I don't know why I'm waiting in the wings. When the supervisors had their meeting, they excluded two other applicants, and that was Gold Hill and me. And for some reason, at the last minute, I got a letter from Paul that said, "Oh, you fall into the moratorium, and you don't. Your application was incomplete," which I think is kind of strange, since I spent thousands of dollars on the application, filled out reams of papers, and then at the last minute to get an email, especially after I just expanded my septic system to accommodate a 200-person event. I think my circumstance is a little bit different. I noticed by the questions that you as planners asked, there seems to be a lot of common sense, like we want to come up with a ordinance that works, but at the same time, not one that's so restrictive we eliminate agritourism, or perhaps a way for agriculture to get supplemented financially. In terms of what's on the board here, most of the stuff that's listed is actually pretty reasonable. On the other hand, by limiting a $1,000, or by requiring a $1,000 gross per acre production, you kind of limit that. I was a cattle rancher, so I know this for a fact. I had a 700-acre cattle ranch up in off Highway 29 above Napa, and you can't make $1,000 per acre on a cattle ranch. Maybe a feedlot, but not a cattle ranch. But in this particular case, you sort of limit it to vineyards. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, because about the only agriculture that you can put in that kind of density to produce 1,000 an acre would be a vineyard. And that's about what I have, probably one of the larger vineyards in the county. It seems a little unreasonable to request that you double the acreage when the concentration of an event is fairly limited, perhaps limited to a 3,000-foot area for 100 people. So that might be something. By the way, you know this, but those are recommendations. It's not hard and fast. You got to follow these rules. At least I think you look at it that way, don't you? The recommendations are what they're intended to be as recommendations, rather than, well, we got to make the Ag Commission or the Ag MAC people feel like they get everything they ask for. I think that the final, tell me if I'm wrong, is the final decision by you folks, or do you take everything else into consideration?
By boards,
Board,
ask us.
Yeah,
Pardon me?
the Board of Supervisors is
The Board of Supes. In terms of burdening the county with code enforcement.
Were you asking if an applicant comes in, or were you asking just about the proposal that we're looking at here?
I'm sorry, I want to make sure I heard you. Go ahead.
Well, see, there's some performance criteria that we'll be making a recommendation on to the Board of Supervisors, and they'll make the final decision.
Gotcha.
I think that's the answer you just got.
Okay.
But now, when and if you go forward with your proposal after these rules are written and approved by the supervisors, then your application will be considered given the performance criteria.
Right.
And so were you asking if it makes a decision?
I frankly wasn't, I didn't understand the process. I didn't understand that you folks become advisory. I thought it actually could stay at this level and the decision could be made.
As far as the use permit, or as far as?
As far as an MUP and how it's drafted and what the final draft looks like.
Okay, well, that could be final here.
Okay.
If it's a conditional use permit.
Okay. I think
as far as the zoning text amendment,
right.
The supervisors will decide on that.
Well, and even then, we could approve it, and it would be appealed.
Yeah, it could be appealed, yeah.
I think what you said is kind of important, because it led me to one of my notes where I said that I don't think it's going to be possible for us to draft, or saying us, not like I'm included, but I probably am because I precipitated all this, but I'm not certain that we can really draft an ordinance or an MUP guideline that's going to fit all cases. So since the property, based on what County Council said, since the use permit runs with the land, it seems that there should be some leeway in that application to further limit people or to be less strict in terms of the actual parcel. I mean, this is kind of common sense. If it's on a shared road, then that's going to be obviously more restrictive than somebody on Sierra College. So I don't know how you're going to be able to draft one ordinance that covers everything you need to do without having the ability to say, well, we're going to issue your permit, but your maximum number is going to be 80 people or whatever, rather than you can have one ordinance that covers everybody's needs, where everybody wants to have 200 people on a private road that causes issues. And I think this is all about property rights for the applicant and property rights for the neighbors. And actually, I'm really fond of some of the people that that question what we want to do. For example, Carol Rubin and Marilyn Jasper and Pat Burke. They all have really pretty much common sense approaches to what needs to be done. And if we put this all together and we come up with an ordinance, it seems that we're going to have some way to be able to regulate abuse. And it's abuse of neighbors, really, in terms of sound, traffic, issues with perhaps alcohol.
Yeah, well, and actually that's what we're going through this process.
I understand. So my suggestion, for what it's worth, is that I'm not sure we can draft one ordinance that says, here's what you get to do. I think it's going to have to be tiered so that the facility size, the facility location, and some of the other features that mitigate those concerns that the neighbors rightfully have should be addressed in some way.
Yeah, I think you're questioning how the process will work, and I think that's a question that, after we get through with the public comment here, that I'd like to ask staff maybe to give us some clarification on that.
Okay.
So we'll try and get an answer for that.
I'll try to wrap this up. So my last statement was, I know that a lot of times people have this concern that if we draft an ordinance that we're going to get a rush at the planning department for multiple applicants, and I'm not certain that there's that many people as naive as I am, because frankly, it's not a lucrative system, not a lucrative business. With property taxes, what they are, we're facing somewhere between 15, it's quite expensive. If you have a property that's, for example, developed, you're in excess of $1 million or $2 or $3 million investment, those taxes become staggering. So this is just a way for us to be able to offset the cost of property tax, and without some kind of an ordinance, we're really going to harm agriculture overall in the county. At this point, our taxes are around $15,000 a year, and you certainly can't pay for that on a 14 or 15 acre parcel with mandarins or sheep or anything else. It's an expensive process. Anyway, and I hope that that we're able to consider the length of George was talking about the length of an event and mentioned 12 hours. As much as I'm for what I want to do and have events, that seems almost excessive. An event should be, I would think, no more than 8 hours. If you wanted to feel like you're regulating and controlling things, why would you have an event that ran 12 hours? That seems like an awfully long time. In other words, that's dusk to dawn practically, or 8 in the morning till 8 at night. That's an awfully long event. So I think if you considered perhaps maybe 8 hours, that would be a little bit more reasonable.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Lori Lewis, and I live at 6245 Wise Road. This has been a long process, but I'm very proud of the process. We started with a very, very vague ordinance that was open to interpretation and was open to exploitation. I think the work that you guys have all done and that the county has done and that the public has almost demanded has come through with some reassurance that A, there's a voice in government, which is very, very inspirational at this point in our government. 2, that there's considerations for the surrounding neighbors versus the property taxes and everything else. So I'm walking away with the system does work, but you can't give up on it and you have to keep at it. And so thank you, gentlemen, for listening to my ranting and raving. On the good news, the winery that I've had a problem with is in compliance. I have peace and quiet, which then makes me a more tolerable person. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for listening to all my ranting and raving, and I'm positive that this will have a really, really positive outcome. Thank you, gentlemen.
Patricia Burke, Newcastle. I also want to add my thanks to all of you, to George, to all of the people who've been involved in this very lengthy and sometimes acrimonious process. I would like to endorse the recommendations that came from the public and from the MAC meetings and from the Ag Department. And I'd also like to have you consider adding a recommendation that under no circumstances may the process called zoning clearance be used in any of these event center considerations. It completely negates the possibility of public input when zoning clearance is used, simply because of the time that a zoning clearance is limited to and the fact that no noticing is done. And also, back to code enforcement, all of the work that's been done by all of us is absolutely useless without meaningful enforcement. Thank you very, very much again.
Hello, Jeff Evans, Bear River Winery in Meadow Vista, California. I basically just have a couple of questions for George. One of them is about the definition that he's using for an event. I believe George said 5 people or more. Is that correct? Correct. And that definition of an event, is that for both event centers and for community centers? Because they are somewhat divided in this proposed zoning ordinance.
It would be for anyone who is having an event at a community center, a commercial event center, or an agricultural event center. Now, bear in mind, community centers and commercial event centers. Thank you. I didn't realize I didn't have my mic on. Do not have the limitation of events that agricultural event centers have. It would be as specified by the use permit. Mostly the things that everyone has been talking about only apply to the agricultural event centers.
Okay, well, I appreciate the clarification. It's still kind of mind-boggling to me as far as a number, because I think like even in like Don's case, I know myself, I do 2 cars pull into my winery to taste, and I've got 5 people. And so, you know, I'm worried that this might run over later into the winery ordinance, you know, that, 5 people seems like an awfully small number to be considered an event. You know, if you have a tasting room or a tasting area, or a mandarin farm. We just did the thing with irrigation that the Agricultural Commission sponsored at a mandarin farm, and there was probably, 20 people there. Is that now an event? And that mandarin farm, they sell mandarins. People, 2 cars drive in, they've got 5 people there. That's an event when they're just selling bags of mandarins. I think the number is just extremely
It's not an event. So understand, one of the reasons that we separated out community centers from wineries and other agricultural uses is because wineries, as soon as we're through the community center ordinance, we will come back with the winery ordinance. The winery ordinance may have very different standards for an event than a community center based on a winery use, which is significantly different than a community center.
But you understand the dual use model here of many of these businesses, like for Don. You know, he has a tasting room in a building that also wants to be an event center, and so his normal customer base coming in on a weekend would be considered an event, even though he's not having an event because he has more than 5 people there.
It's not really a social gathering of people. It's individuals coming to purchase wine or taste wine. That would not be an event. That would be a separate use.
Okay, I still think that the number's too low. The other question I have for you, and I brought this up at the MAC meeting, is if you look at the current zoning ordinance for community centers, which is now being divided and expanded, there are several categories of properties that are commercial, and I'm on one of them. It's resort. It's a commercial property, and currently it only needs a C, the thing that was mentioned, which is just clearance from the front desk. You just come in and say, I'm going to do a community center, which is not an event center because it's clearly defined in the new ordinance, right? A community center would be certain behavioral things that had actually something to do with the community, like you've got the Boy Scouts, or you've got the friendly neighborhood group meeting, or you've got some other community-based organization that wants to meet at your facility, and it's not a for-profit event. It's not, you're not trying to have a band or a wedding or something like that. And now, in the new ordinance, that same zoning requires a conditional use permit. So, you've really expanded on what's required for a small property owner on commercial property to operate some sort of a meeting area that is very limited in nature, and you've taken a huge step from just zoning clearance to this conditional use permit process, and I just think that's a mistake. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else would like to comment on this? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission for comments and discussion.
Got a couple, if I could, please.
Sure.
Yes, a couple of them. Code enforcement, I agree, it's been said, is critical to all this. On-call code enforcement, as big as this county is, and actually, I guess probably with no requirements that those who work there live in the county even. I mean, if you make a complaint call and somebody shows up 2.5 hours later,
Might be fast.
party's over, I mean, that's not a fix in my mind. I think that needs to be addressed, I'm sure separately, but with more attention and something with some quicker response and some more teeth. Question I had, the number of events, when we put a number to it, my understanding was that was a maximum and the conditions of approval could apply a lower number to that. Was I not understanding that correctly? Or?
No, you understood it correctly. It actually, in the ordinance, it's not a minimum or a maximum. It is 26 and or as specified by the use permit, so you could go lower or higher.
Okay, I mean, I'm just addressing the comments up
Yeah.
here where they said the number should be reduced.
Right.
I mean, we're not guaranteeing anybody who applies a number of events until we
Right.
see the conditions that surround it.
And that echoes what Mr. DuPont was saying, that it's very hard to write one ordinance that fits all sizes. So when we originally went through that was why so many of these things say, or as specified by the conditional use permit, because they are going to have to be tailored. Up, down, all those sorts of things.
And I guess that would go back to my comments regarding a shared road. I don't know that we want to get into overextending somebody's easement rights, but on the other hand, I don't think we want to clip somebody's easement rights that already exist either. We're kind of stating up front that as a condition to get in this, you have to be a commercial operation. So what we're doing is we're not introducing a commercial operation onto a shared road, we're just giving approval to expand one. And again, I think that needs to be up to staff to look at the conditions that surround that and see if there is adequate ingress and egress. I don't care whether it's their sole road or whether it's a shared road. The conditions to get in and out need to be the same. If they can't be met, you can't have it. But to just automatically clip it because there's a second driveway off the road without getting into what type of easement they have or whatever may not be appropriate either. And then that would take up my regarding the dollar amount and whether it's a commercial operation or not. I think that needs to be up to the Ag Commissioner to, I know there is a definition of a bona fide commercial agricultural operation, and it involves whether they follow best management practices and what type of operation they're running and all that. And I think George brought it up, whether they have weather conditions, whether our drought takes some property out of production or something like that in any one given year. And I think also the pure contention that a dollar amount, whether stated or proved, can bring about, it should just be up to the Agricultural Commissioner to review an application and determine that it's a bona fide commercial agricultural operation. And I think there needs to be a provision for planning to be requested to review or for planning to request that the Agricultural Commissioner review that at any given time, that it is still a bona fide commercial agricultural operation. And so that way if property goes out of production, or if that somebody like George can make the determination that it's out of production because there's no water, but it will be back in production as soon as there is, or that it's out of production because we got a 10,000-foot building on it now that's doing better as an event center than the agriculture was, so we're not bothering with the production so much. We're focusing purely on the events. But I think that's something that needs to be up for review, either based on complaints or based on suspicion of planning or whatever. But it should be, the set dollar amount, I think, is one. It's too much of too much contention to prove, too easy to fudge some numbers and state it anyway. So why not have it reviewed? And regardless of the dollar amount, if you're following the practices, if you're doing what you're supposed to do, and you can convince the Ag Commissioner that you're doing it, that he can certify it as a bona fide commercial agricultural operation.
Well, I can see that. I suspect we should probably still have some minimum so that the agricultural commissioner has something to work with to start with, as far as making a determination if it's a legitimate commercial agricultural business or not.
See, I think the state has a definition
well, whatever
of what a bona fide
should be one that we should incorporate then, so that there's not an argument every time anybody brings in saying, well, no, really, I've got 4 apple trees, not 3, so I can, legitimately be a commercial outfit. There's got to be something, like you say, recognized by the commissioner, something for him to work off of.
Well, let me ask staff. Somebody comes in for permit, and it's going to go to the agricultural commissioner, and the staff here at the planning department has said, well, we have this performance criteria, which is $1,000 gross per acre per year, as well as if you have any prime farm soils, you can't put your event center on those. And so then you turn it over to the Ag Commissioner. What's the process at that point? And then I guess kind of getting with what's being said here, we're kind of counting on the Ag Commissioner to use some judgment. Like if it's up in Forest Hill, it may be a little bit different than if it's row crops or a mandarin orchard. And so I guess what would the process be from the planning department, and how would you apply some discretion into the process so that somebody just doesn't get kicked off the truck at the very beginning? They have a chance to make their case.
Yeah, the way the process would work is an event center would come in for their conditional use permit. They would most likely be subject to environmental review. We would circulate that environmental document to the Ag Commissioner with a note that says, please note that this is an agricultural event center. We're going to require you to make a determination or ask you to make a determination on these following issues. If you have any input into the environmental document, please give us a comment. Hopefully we would get comments at that point about unique farmland, about agricultural production, that sort of thing. And then, as part of the use permit, we would circulate that entitlement application to the Ag Commissioner and say, we need written verification that it's making whatever, let's say $1,000 gross per acre per year, and please verify that the site plan shows that this is not on those stated types of farmland. One of the things that it occurred to me as I've heard these conversations is there's two things about the $1,000 gross per acre per year that you might want to say. You have the potential to put in the realistic, like say realistic potential, like if someone has all their grapevines in and it's 15 acres and they're going to be producing 2 or 3 years from now. Maybe you want to allow them to have an agricultural event center and go through the process based on the realistic notion that they're going to do that. The other thing that occurs to me is you might want to cap the $1,000 gross per acre per year at maybe $40,000, which would be the upper end, a large agricultural event center, because it's unrealistic to think that if someone has 500 acres, that they're pulling down $500,000 in revenue from an agricultural use. But if you held them to that $40,000, that's a more realistic a number as they get larger and larger instead of just $1,000 per gross acre.
That makes sense.
Well, then, I guess what I'm wondering about too, the $1,000 an acre is something that the Ag Commission thought of and agreed to, and I think they were thinking of some specific type of operations and how much money those operations should make. But how hard of a number is 1,000? I mean, does the Ag Commissioner have an opportunity if it's less than 1,000 per acre per year? Or that
if you put that in as a standard, then you could put or as specified by the use permit. My impression from the Ag Commissioner and the discussions that I've had with them, that $1,000 gross per acre per year can be a fairly high bar for some agricultural type uses. Dryland grazing. If you had 20 acres of dryland grazing, that can be a fairly high bar. If you're growing rice or mandarins or, you're a vineyard, not a super high bar at $1,000 per acre. You have the ability to completely reject that notion. You have the ability to lower the dollar amount if you so choose. It is just a recommendation that the Ag Commission is making to you. You have the ability to do whatever you would like with it.
Okay, well, I guess what makes me a little nervous is it is a high bar.
It can
be,
yeah.
But it sounds like it's almost an absolute, too. And, there's circumstances, kind of like we're talking about with the roads, that maybe somebody's operation would qualify, but they can't get over that bar, so they're kicked out.
Well, there's the other option of doing what we've done with the other performance standards. You could say, or as specified as part of the conditional use permit, a number for agricultural production, which would give you the ability as part of, this is like the starting point. Do you make $1,000 per acre per year? No, you don't. Okay. When you go through the environmental review process and the conditional use process, you better have a really, really good explanation of why you don't meet that standard. And you're going to have to convince the Planning Commission that you are an actual bona fide agricultural use. So let's say someone does do dryland grazing and they make $800 an acre, and that's what they do.
Mm-hmm.
you might want to consider that as being, this is the kind of person that we would like to keep in dryland grazing, and this would be an alternative revenue stream. So you might want to have that ability. But like I said, that would be up to you as a policy decision to decide whether you want to hold that firm or whether you want to give yourself some latitude with regard to looking at reasonable alternatives to the $1,000 as part of the conditional use permit process.
And I think we would be relying pretty heavily on what the Ag Commissioner and the other farm experts really evaluate. But I know from my perspective, I think I would feel a little bit better about the $1,000 a year if it was as you described.
Okay.
As well as the soils too, because there could be some cases where, there's not a whole lot of real highly prime soils, but there could be some cases that would apply there.
Yep.
Yeah, just like my comment, I'm not going to make a specific recommendation on any of these. I think they're a good compilation of what I read in all the MAC meetings and all the discussion here. But I think the one thing when we finally make a recommendation, when George comes back with, I guess, a draft of the final recommendation that we'll send on to the supervisors, is that we can't lose sight of that we're talking about an agricultural event center, not an event center. We always leave, not always, but a lot of times we leave the word agricultural off of it when we say event center. This event center does need to be connected somewhat with the agricultural endeavor on that property, whether it be forestry or even planting a vineyard. I'm not making any specific recommendation, but I think that's what we're trying to do. I think what George is trying to do, and I think that's what all the comments of the public are trying to do, is make sure that the two aren't disconnected.
Right.
Because it's not a commercial zone. It's an agricultural zone. At least that's what I'm thinking we're talking about. So we're saying we want to augment that to help viability, sustainability of agriculture, not the other way around. That we want the event center just because we want an event center and more revenue on the property. The property right now is zoned agriculture.
Where it's secondary versus primary.
It's agriculture, and you might have a residence on it. People move maybe out there just to have a residence on a 5-acre parcel or 10-acre parcel, and they don't expect to raise anything on it, I guess. But if they're going to go for an event center in an agricultural zone, they better show somebody, whether it be us or the Ag Commissioner, that they actually are serious about producing what the maximum or what best practices for that particular agricultural endeavor can do on that property. And I think it does need to, I think when you do put a real number in there, it's hard to justify all the time, but I think when George was mentioning some language, this is a guideline or as discussed or modified by the Ag Commission and or this Planning Commission, or some wording. I hate to be too weasel worded about it, but I think we do need some flexibility in that part of the ordinance. I like what's been brought forward, and I read through all the comments on the Macs, and they were busy out there, and as well as George. Making these comments, and I really appreciate that as a planning commissioner, and I think we all do, because that's what we're supposed to be doing, is getting input from everybody, as many as we can, and then trying to make a kind of a rational decision. Hopefully that's a good word, a rational decision on the inputs. So that's all I'm going to say on that. Again, thank you, George. I think you should ask for a raise, though, after this. Considering, or letters of recommendation from all the people that think that you've done such a great job, which I think you have to.
Well, maybe Michael Johnson's listening today.
Yeah.
Well, this mic was off. Sorry. Well, considering what we're asked to be doing, I think perhaps we should go through these just a little bit individually, because probably some of these we could say, yes, we would recommend this just the way it's said, and then a couple of the other ones we may want to change. But at least to give some direction to George to take to the board, we've got to make some hard rules and some decisions. It's not up to us to be wishy-washy on everything. So things like potential and possible and things like that. We've got to try to get around that a little bit and try to make something a little more concrete. Otherwise, we're not really recommending anything. If we recommend that, for example, the second, code enforcement should be available on weekends, I think that's a pretty hard, fast recommendation we can make. We don't have to tell George to come back and get something different. We should give at least some consideration to some of the things that we like right now, the way they are, or tell them what we want to change.
No, that makes sense.
So I'm going to go ahead and say, just to start off with, code enforcement should be available on weekends to deal with event center issues. Well, as far as I can see, not only is that a no-brainer, but I think at the present we have, one code enforcement officer in this whole county?
One effective one. We're working on getting more.
Supervisors that we don't permit anything until we have some more code enforcement people to enforce it. That's a simple recommendation on that one right there. I mean, it's not a hard and fast rule. We're not making the law, but that would be a recommendation that I would be comfortable giving to the board. Anybody else have anything like that?
I think it's good, and I didn't mean to say by my comments that we shouldn't go through, because I agree with 90% of what's up there, so we can go through each
Same here.
individually.
Same here. 95%.
As well as incorporate some of the comments that were made by the public.
Right. Well, and I had a couple on those. One was zoning clearance, from the zoning administrator, where any of these would come before us. So that way it is more of a public process versus, just ZA on it. And then one thing that came up too was the concentration of centers, because I know from the beginning of this, when we were talking about it, I guess in my mind I was thinking, well, potentially you could have a lot of people just in one area where you'd have 5 or 6, and then it becomes a contest, not so much for the agricultural part of it, but if it's a wedding or something because they have a pretty piece of property or whatever, and so, it just dilutes the use of it, the event centers. And I go along too with the idea of maybe going down if, George, if you have any questions on direction, I think we've talked about the $1,000.
Yeah,
you feel pretty.
Yeah, let me just, if you don't mind, I'll just walk through them real quick. Would that be okay?
No, that's fine, because maybe in more detail and just see if we're all on the same page.
So on the $1,000 gross per acre per year, if what I think I was hearing from the commission was that you'd also like me to add some language that states, or as specified by the conditional use permit, which would be up to the commission to decide if it's reasonable if you don't make $1,000 gross acre per year. That would be in conjunction with a recommendation from the ag commissioner, and that would be up to you. That's an easy thing to do. I can do that.
And you put a cap on it too?
I would put a cap on it. No one needs to make over $40,000 a year to apply for an agricultural event center. The other thing is do basically the same thing with the farmland. We can put, I'm not sure that this needs to be in the ordinance, but the agricultural event center should not be protected by the Placer County Right to Farm ordinance. I believe that's also probably a good thing to have in there. I didn't hear very much discussion about whether you wanted to increase the size of the existing event centers. I think at this point, unless you tell me something different, I would leave them at 10, 20, and 40. Agricultural event centers should not be accessed via a shared private road. There was a lot of discussion about this. I can either, as part of this ordinance, you can either give me direction to go back and review some alternatives, or, I think at this point, you either have to decide that you're going to allow them on shared private roads, and you're going to look at it on a case-by-case basis with a conditional use permit, and if it's not appropriate as a policy and a decision-making body, well, not as a policy-making body at that point, but as a decision-making body. I'm sorry.
No, I'd like to ask County Council just a question. If we allow a agricultural event center on a private road, and there's issues that come up afterwards, was the county going to be liable for something? Or how do we get sucked into it, I guess is what in other words.
How do we get sucked into the lawsuits? Easily. It doesn't mean they prevail. We have seen it on multiple occasions, and it's not just the shared road. It's, for example, a use permit where we then find out that there was a private easement for, say, a water line between neighbors, and it wasn't found, and suddenly the county's in a lawsuit because we allowed a use over a private water line. We take those on a case-by-case basis. That's really all we can do. Things you might want to consider, too, that I've seen in other jurisdictions, it doesn't lessen the liability. Nothing really does. Private roads are still traveled by the public. Owners of property have liability for that. I think the question becomes more an issue of the potential increase in intensity of use on a private road versus a public. Again, that's really a policy decision on this commission and the board's behalf as to whether you want to consider as a policy allowing an increased use on what is not a county-maintained road. So, and we don't get into the issue at that point of maintenance. That's the private property owner. That's another issue we hear a lot about as well. You know, who's going to maintain for that? I won't go into all the details of how that's established. It can be through road maintenance. There's a wide variety. But I think to answer your question is, I don't know that we get out of the liability. I think you have to look at it more from the standpoint of the policy. Should every event center be accessing from one road, a driveway, onto a public road as a matter of policy, or is the commission going to consider a private road? And I believe there is a requirement in here to ensure that there is permission to use it. As a matter of policy, are you going to consider that, knowing that it will probably raise issues of use, whether the use is compatible, but of course that's something you take up with each use permit. Is it compatible? And you have the ability on each one of these, even if you allow it on a shared road, to consider the facts, circumstances of the individual use permit and determine based on those facts and circumstances whether it is appropriate to grant that use permit.
If this becomes a blanket policy, as I think it's being thought of right now, then when we get down to a winery ordinance or some other ordinance in the county, that probably would that be a precedence that follows through in the other?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, see, like there are several wineries that operate on private roads right now, and we're going to be looking at a winery ordinance. And so up to this point in time, it's been a sticky issue, but it hasn't been a blanket policy that I'm aware of yet.
Well,
but if we do it here, then we're probably obligated to do it with the wineries too, right?
No. Two things about that. One, when the general law is that when a zoning ordinance comes into effect, uses that were legally established under the prior zoning code provisions are legal non-conforming uses. In other words, they were legal at the time. Something might have changed. We see this typically with zoning. It's probably the easiest example. Say you have a property that is zoned commercial, but then there's an overall zoning conformity that changes it to residential. We don't ask that property owner to stop the commercial use because that was a legal use at the time, but the zoning code has changed. So those uses continue to operate within the parameters of their use permit or whatever they had at the time, or the zoning code provisions. And for uses, for future uses, the new zoning code applies.
And so we'd be obligated to apply this, if we make this blanket with regards, or the supervisors do with regards to event centers, then it would
And they still have the right to change.
Be pretty hard not to do that with the future winery.
I disagree. I disagree. I think you're looking, these are separate. The winery ordinance is going to come separately. It was done intentionally to keep the two. I think you have two different industries, two different uses that you're dealing with. Right now, what you're talking about are recommendations for an ordinance that will go forward to the board for event community centers. And within the parameters of that use, what standards do you want to establish? I do not think that it in any way binds you to make the same decision on any of these points when the winery ordinance comes forward. You will be looking at the winery ordinance within the context of that industry, those uses, and you'll deal with it separately. Does that mean you'll come to the same decision? You might, but what I'm saying is establishing a particular standard from one ordinance does not set a precedent automatically, legally, for another ordinance that will come before you to decide.
Yeah, I think that answers my question. I guess, though, in my mind, I'm thinking that when we take up the winery ordinance, we're going to have to be pretty clear in our thinking on what's different, what the distinctions are if we decide to go a different way.
The general public's going to look at it.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. Whatever we approve here, the general public, I think, is going to come back hard and fast and say, hey, look, if you're allowing it on a private road and you didn't on the other, then you need to do it here. So,
George, when you review a project or like a conditional use permit, you look at the quality of access on the public roads leading to the project as well?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, to just say that you're going to evaluate the entire ingress and egress to the whole project and make a determination, I mean, is that really adding a whole lot more brain damage to the process?
No, it's something we already do already. We would require that they provide proof of how wide the access is.
So whether shared road or public road, you're still going through this whole process all the way down the line from some point way back here all the way up to the driveway of the project and the parking and all that, and it's either adequate or it's not.
Correct.
That's a different question than what's Pat's talking about, because we're talking about standards for, like you say, any access or egress, but having it via shared road, that's a different thing.
Well, it requires different rights and easement and stuff.
I don't think the county needs to open that can of worms, because we'll be in it forever. And
but on the other hand,
every single MAC here said no private.
When somebody has an adequate easement, you're then clipping their rights to the use of it.
Well, we're clipping rights for saying all of these things up here. I mean, clipping rights is what we're doing. That's what planning's all about, saying you've got to have 10 acres. You can't go away with 5. I mean, so.
I think we ought to get a consensus here, go out to private road and then go move on. If they're,
right,
at least today, I'm in favor of leaving it the way it is. And I guess we heard one other one. Is there anybody else that wants that private road left that way?
Well, you know, there is a wording, unless otherwise approved in the conditional use permit. Could be, I mean, you could have that statement and put the
unless
or something like that.
Unless something else, and I don't know what the unless is.
Well, one of the examples, and I don't know, not knowing the Galgani parcel where they have a lot of acreage behind 2 very small acre parcels, and they're doing agricultural trying to, yeah. But what do you do if say you have a driveway it can be 1,000 feet long, but the first 150 or 200 feet have houses on each side that access it, and you own the rest of the property all the way down, take care of the road except for that 250 feet, and it could be a 30-foot wide roadway, gravel and everything, and then you say, can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
so they do, yeah, that's exactly
right.
Without
some
if
kind
you don't
of way
have
of
10 acres, you can't have a minimum size for agriculture. We're making a decision here. It's a call, yes.
I would support leaving it at the discretion of the review process.
Well, if the wording stays in there as a preference, but you do allow the flexibility in the conditional use permit to allow it.
I wouldn't mind going with that.
So
I
you would
wouldn't
say
mind going
that
with that.
agricultural event centers should not be accessed via a shared private road unless, what?
Huh?
Is it everybody who owns
Unless
the road says yes?
it's
or the
approved in the
board says-
conditional use permit.
What?
Unless it's approved in the conditional use permit.
I don't, okay, what happens when, like you say, these two people who have those houses on the
Well, no.
beginning of the road
Well,
say,
let me
no, we
back-
don't want our road used. That part is our road, not yours.
Well, no,
How
it
do
is,
you answer
this
that?
part is, I'm saying maybe the compromise is that you have to get an
100%
agreement
agreement.
from those two people, or hold harmless or whatever from anything that would be caused by, you know,
I just
whatever
see us
the
opening a
activity.
really can of worms, to be honest with you, for the whole county, for enforcement, for county council and everything else. I think that we're not doing the best by the most people according to what the MAC thinks most people want. And we can just say our recommendation is split on that when we recommend it to the board.
There's one provision that's right now in the proposed ordinance that I wanted to remind you about, and that's 2A under access standards. Any access road, it's on page 11 of your staff report, any access road would have to be determined to comply with county code, state, and local fire standards, and the serving fire agency.
Right,
I just
right.
wanted to remind you that that's already in here.
Sure. Those standards would be necessary for private or public roads. We're talking
Well, I
about
guess-
getting how much
Sure.
permission do we need for a shared road or something.
You know,
That's-
Mickey, I think what you're seeing is the wording that's up there.
Well,
And
what
what-
I'm seeing actually is what the MACs recommended.
Right.
Almost every MAC here said should not be accessed via a shared private
Right.
road.
And I think there's probably not real disagreement with that, except. And the except is maybe a condition like Ken's talking about here.
Wherein 100% of.
And if there's an except, then the discussion would go to the public, and the discussion would come to the planning commission before it could be approved. And
Well, I
so
think
it puts a little bit of discretion in there for the planning commission and the supervisors to recognize an exception. But otherwise, I think that wording, there's pretty wide agreement that stands with.
So what you're thinking is we should put in a condition that on the private versus public road, that it could be allowed under certain circumstances, and then you would list the circumstances, for example, that 100% of everybody who uses and shares and owns this road agrees.
That would be one.
That could be, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's just a little bit of a direction to George, I guess.
Yeah, I think the general perception is that event centers, agricultural event centers should not be on shared roads.
Okay.
I think that's a general perception.
So we're-
But there needs, in some of our minds, there needs to be
some way to
soften it.
to apply some discretion in appropriate
Yeah, because it feels pretty
situations.
bad if I had a piece of
Well,
property
like I said,
that all the neighbors.
we could
said,
recommend
you know,
it
there
to
are
George
only
to
two
put it
people
in.
or one person
Yeah.
on my road, and they said, oh, we're 100% for it, but sorry, you
Can't do it.
do it.
Yeah, the county says you can't do it then, yeah.
It meets some
Okay,
of
well,
the
I'll go
criteria
along that
for the sheriff.
with that consideration, but I don't think it should read just when it comes to us, that it should, you know.
Well, can George work on some language now that he's heard all this?
Yes.
Licking,
I can come back with the language that we have now, and then maybe some additional performance standards, and you could choose between the two. What I'm hopeful is the next time, like I said, next time we come back, what I'm hopeful for is you can tell me, you can make a recommendation on what I bring to you so we can move forward to the board.
Okay.
It won't be a workshop next time. It'll be the actual ordinance.
And we direct you to change it.
Unless you direct me to change it
Or change it
significantly
a little
again.
bit.
One part of it or something.
Yeah, and you can direct me, and I can bring some things forward. You know, you could say, well,
Well, you could bring back 2 or 3 options. One
Yeah.
would be
Yeah.
that one there, period. And then one would be one with this, and
Yeah.
maybe a third one.
okay, on the road things, I'll come back with several options for you to choose
Start
from.
with that one and then.
Yeah.
And go with the other 2.
That's okay by me?
Okay.
Okay.
I don't know if we started with options. And so hopefully when it comes back to the planning commission that have moved beyond options and are pretty clear.
Well, I think we're pretty clear on some of the other ones. I mean,
Yeah.
that one there's the only one.
Yes, and it's the most contentious one in the entire county, according to all the MAC meetings, so obviously that's the one we need to.
Yeah, at this,
most.
I'm sorry. At this point, I'm completely comfortable with the direction that I've gotten from you. I know exactly what to do. Even with the roads, I know exactly that there's no real consensus at this point, and I will come back with 3 options or so for you, and then hopefully.
You may not get people to telling you how such a great job you did.
Right.
Right.
I think if you work right, it could
I'll come back with options, and hopefully you'll be able to choose one of those options and make a recommendation based on those options.
Okay, that sounds good to me.
Next.
Okay, number of events permitted each year should be reduced.
Well, didn't you, Jeff, point out that we have a high limit, but we can reduce that depending on what?
The surrounding conditions and everything else
Right.
that factors into it.
And who would make that decision? Us?
Yes. Yes, you as the planning commission.
Well, I mean the planning commission.
Yeah.
Yeah, you would, as part of the conditional use permit, more or less. It's completely up to you, as part of the use permit.
Well, the MAC seemed to indicate from most of them that they would like it reduced, but if we have a limit, and if we can agree amongst ourselves to actually reduce it on occasion, maybe that would be
I think the issue
to the public, rather than saying, well, you got 26, go ahead, 26.
The issue,
That's the problem.
the issue here is, you can eliminate the economic viability of a proposal very easily by
Limiting the number of events.
limiting it too far down. And I don't know if 26 is enough. Apparently, that's been discussed enough, and nobody's here today to say raise it. So I guess, for now, it sounds like 26 is okay.
And that should certainly tie in with what Ken was saying about how many centers are next to each other, because, if you're doing 26 each and there's another guy half an acre away doing 26 each and a guy only 4 acres away doing 26, then we're starting to get a little, crowded. So it might be something that actually tie together how many events and how close to everybody else the event centers are.
Yeah, well, I guess as far as this goes, you're talking about a maximum of 26?
Well, I understand because what you're getting at, and I think we talked about dealing with concentration of event centers is really what we're wrestling with here. And in all my research, the only place that had any regulation with regard to concentration of event centers was Monterey County. And they had been able to do that because they did a specific plan over sort of like what would be an Apple Hill kind of area. And they knew every in and out of that area. And they said you could have 2 gas stations here. You can have this many event centers here. It's very difficult to police that. And I think the way that you go about dealing with a concentration of event centers is when you go through the environmental document, you have to address the impacts associated with something going in. So if you already have an event center on a private road, the question really that comes up is in part of environmental review, can you adequately mitigate the impacts associated with the second one? And maybe the answer is you really can't, or maybe you can, but you're not obligated to put that kind of density if it seems overburdening. When you look at it, if you had 4 event centers on a 25-foot wide road, the environmental document might say you need to make an overriding consideration that there is some public benefit for this to go in, which is probably not going to happen.
Well, I think that's why the room for some discretion is where you want it. If you're so specific on every item, for one, somebody's going to come in thinking they met it all and they automatically have a project.
Right.
And 2, it's going to be document as thick as Obamacare. And it's still not going to catch everything. There's still going to be a scenario somebody walks in the door with that it doesn't address.
Right.
So I think that reviewing each project on its own merits based on where it's at and what they want to do and everything else is really the only way to do it with some generalized criteria, like the maximum number of events possible, but it could be less depending on where you're at and those kind of things. I think that I don't want to see that discretion stripped out of here.
Okay.
So if I could suggest that, indeed, the number of events and the concentration of event centers should be put in there too. As a recommendation for George to come back with. There's not, like you said, there's nothing in here about concentration. Yeah. So just to inform the board that the recommendations we should be considered the concentration of event centers and the usage number.
And if I understand that right, that would be sort of along with the code enforcement recommendation that while you didn't codify this.
Well, the code enforcement thing we haven't got to, because that's the next big issue, I think, behind the roads.
So what are you talking about, concentration?
Well, if you've got 10-acre parcels and we've got 4 of them next to each other with 26 events, that's different than having one event center on a road that has nobody else around for miles. So he can have 26 events without affecting people as much as the people who have 3 10-acre parcels right next to each other with 26 events. Maybe we'll come up with the decision, though, you've got these concentration of event centers, and they're only allowed to have 14 events per year each instead of 26 each because you're affecting so many other people.
But I don't think we can go back and, if we've approved 3 in an area and they've each been given 26.
Right, well, that's what I want to avoid.
I don't think we can clip those.
I want to avoid that
4 and
happening
5
in the
come
first
and
place.
apply.
So that we have to put in some kind of a policy decision so that that doesn't happen. Because that's what's causing most of the, discourse. Well, and it's not like we're telling them what to do. We're just making a recommendation to the board that they consider that the number of event centers next to each other plus the number of events works together.
I don't know, you have some suggested wording?
No, but that's George's job.
You're so good at it.
I think he did pretty good where he said, like, on one roadway, because it does impact the general public.
Well, obviously, what Ken suggested about, thinking about the number of events, the number of event centers next to each other bears mention or merit of some sort, recommending it to the board that they consider it. And George can write it up and he can bring it back and we can vote and see if that's the truth or not, but since we're going to
Well, I think we're getting to the final stages here, and we've considered this before, so it seems like we need to say more than just concentration, use more than that word, or is that what you're just talking about? What do you think, Ken?
Well, I think there's the accessibility issue, on a roadway. And I think George just sort of mentioned that is if you had 4 event centers and they were sized where they could have 200 or 300 people at each event, well, if it was all the same weekend and the primary access is that one road, all of a sudden you've slowed the road. So for public safety and all, all those normal issues.
Well, that's part of the environmental process, so
yeah.
It's not a standard or a performance standard, is it?
Well, performance.
Part of the
environmental
performance
criteria.
standard is reflected in the environmental
I don't know if you do the economic part of it, if they're all doing it at the same time.
Well, I guess what I'm wondering is this something that would be addressed in the environmental document, or does it need to be stated in a performance standard?
Sounds like a legal question.
Yeah.
Are you guys waiting? Are you waiting on us?
Yeah, we're just
okay. I wasn't sure if you wanted to
sit
stop
here
or
and
not.
save us from grounding.
I think the concentration issue could be addressed through the conditional use permit process and the environmental review process. I think if you put a hard and fast number without a lot of information to make that decision, it's problematic. Like I said, the only time that I found any county, and I talked to 13 counties, the only time that I found that anyone was willing to talk about concentrations of uses like this was after they had done a specific plan, which is a very, very specific document. I mean, they knew exactly where everything was. You're talking about an ordinance that will cover the entire county with the exception of Tahoe. So it's very hard. There are some areas where it may be appropriate to have 3 or 4, not far, way far out in western Placer County. You may have a part of the county, like out on Gold Hill road where it's not appropriate to have them close together. And I think it's something that you have to look at on a case-by-case basis. And when you put the hard and fast number in, I think you do a disservice to everybody. So that's just my opinion.
Yeah, so in other words, if somebody comes in and says, I'm thinking of doing a ag event center, and there's 5 around them, then you just sort of say, okay, this will be one of the things that's going to be looked at as the concentration.
Yeah, you say, look, there's a heavy concentration of these already. The road is small, the county road is small. We're going to have to look at the road and the traffic carrying capacity. We're going to have to look at the times that you're proposing to do events, because if everyone's going to do them at Saturday from 3 to 5, and you're going to have 1,600 people all coming and going at the same time, that's a problem. So you're going to have to look at all those peak flows. You're going to have to look at the uses. You're going to have to do all that. I believe the issue will be very well vetted by the time it gets to the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission will be able to make a very informed decision about whether this is an appropriate use or not. And one of those things would be based on concentration.
That on that statement where it says that the suggested or proposed number of events permitted each year should be maximum of 26, as I think we said, and consideration shall also be given to the number of event centers already in the area. Something that allows the proponent to know that he comes in and he doesn't automatically get 26, or that he doesn't automatically get an event center if there's like 14 on the road already. That he'll have to take that into consideration as part of what he's applying for, just so they know.
And so the other thing that I have not brought up here, the other place that this would be discussed right up front is when you do a conditional use permit, and when a conditional use permit has original jurisdiction at the Planning Commission, we have to do a pre-development meeting. Okay, and a pre-development meeting is actually before the environmental document and before the entitlements, like the use permit. And we would talk to them about all those things and say, look, this is what happened. You have these 4 here. You're going to have special issues. The Planning Commission very well may decide that there's this many events happening in the summertime. You're not going to get as many as the other ones because you came in 4th or 3rd. So, there's all these stops and processes by which we can disclose all this and let people know. From a land use standpoint and being a land use planner, the concentration issue is the one that I am least concerned about. That's the one that gives me the least amount of pause about having to deal with it.
Why is that, George?
Because I believe it's an issue that is easily addressed through the process.
Even though we have the more fragmented agricultural use than anybody else in the state?
Yeah, I do, and I think that's why you can address it through the use. I mean, you can simply, when you go through environmental review, you can go, look, you're surrounded by 1-acre parcels that people live on these houses, and you want to have this many events, and it's really not appropriate. You have to make a finding for a conditional use permit that it doesn't endanger the health, safety, or general welfare of the surrounding properties. Very easily addressed through our process. So this is one that doesn't give me pause. I think, well, it on the surface looks like it would be hard to deal with. I think it's very easy to deal with.
And I would say from the SEQA perspective, keep in mind that each one of these is a discretionary permit, which means it will go through SEQA review. One of the basic parameters of SEQA is to look at the cumulative impacts. Cumulative impacts would be looked at if proposed use D comes in and there's A, B, and C right in the same vicinity. Are there cumulative impacts with respect to traffic, noise, air quality? All those would have to be looked at through the environmental review. If, for example, one of them, let's say traffic, we can't determine that a cumulative impact can be mitigated to less than significant level, that means there probably will not be a neg deck or a mitigated neg deck, but it may bump up to an EIR. If it bumps up to an EIR, a lot more process, a lot more time, a lot more money. And if you still can't mitigate it, as George mentioned, then the decision-making body has to make a finding as to whether the benefit of that use outweighs the impact. So your environmental review does assist you in terms of looking at the concentration issue. The other thing I think you need to keep in mind, too, is just what George said. We're talking about from Granite Bay to rural Lincoln. I don't know how you would devise a distance standard. It's easy if you're in a city and you say you won't have a liquor store. A liquor store, there's a minimum distance requirement of, say, 500 feet. Well, okay, that's pretty easy if you've got blocks. What do you do when you have a rural area where 500 feet could be the same property? I mean, it could be a meaningless standard, and I agree with George. I think it's one that can be dealt with through the process.
Okay, and I think you've answered it very well for me, because my concern on the whole thing is somebody coming in that's maybe a farmer, and because of the agricultural part of it and everything, doesn't understand the process, and all of a sudden could be going through the process and spending $50,000 to get to a point that it's no. Where if in the pre-planning meeting where you can sort of say, look, this probably got a 90% fail rate before you even get to the commission, because it's going to cost you this much and stuff.
Consider this as part of the
right. And I guess, for my benefit and maybe for the public's benefit.
Yeah, and so you understand, when we're in pre-development, because we're public servants, we would never tell someone you have a 90% fail rate. What we would tell them is you have significant challenges that you would need to overcome, and these are what they are. So just...
Well, I'm not
right.
saying, I'm just being...
We would make sure that they knew all of their significant issues that would need to be addressed, and then it would be up to them to make a decision.
The idea that the significant, and one of those would be concentration. So that's
yes.
what I was trying to get to in the first place.
Right.
We know that they may not just get it automatically because they fit the
right.
criteria.
Absolutely. We will absolutely make them aware of that.
Okay.
So with that, we would move on to... I know what I'm going to do with the roads. I know with the number of events we're going to do through the conditional use permit. I know about we've gone through the concentration issue. Code enforcement should be available on weekends to deal with event center issues. I will state this again. Staff's recommendation is that you don't codify this in this ordinance. We already have the code enforcement process codified other areas. I think the idea of sending a recommendation when this goes to the board that we need more code enforcement is the best one. The recommendation that you shouldn't approve this until you're sure we will have more code enforcement. And I believe, as a land use planner, the thing that will send the clearest, straightforward message is that if you go through the process and you get a use permit for an event center and you break the conditions, you do not follow the conditions, that we as staff bring it immediately back to you for reconsideration and you revoke it. Okay? I think beyond any code enforcement process, beyond any performance standard, I think if you hold people accountable as a hearing body, what you told them they needed to do to have an event center and they don't do it, and you come back and you revoke it, I think you'll probably have to do that about once. And I think you will never have another issue.
George, doesn't it take code enforcement to generate the complaint to get back to us, though?
You know what? In this instance, it would not. If we went out and we could verify, if we got a complaint at the planning department and we verified that, yes, someone gave us, because everyone has
Yeah, but
iPhones.
you guys work the same hours as code enforcement.
No, but let me tell you what happens here, because this is a technologically advanced culture here. I guarantee you, if someone breaks the rules Monday morning, I will have 20 PDF videos or whatever they do, and we'll have pictures. We'll have pictures of all the cars that parked on the private road. We'll have all this evidence. We'll go out and we'll go, what are you guys doing?
The band playing out in the open.
And then, depending on how bad it was or the explanation, if they go, hey, it happened. We had 600 people. We're only supposed to have 400. It's like, boom, you're back to the commission. And you can decide whether you want to let them go forward or whether you want to, yank the use permit. And you'll have to do it one time.
I concur with George on that.
Well, I think, too, what I'm hearing George say, and As far as staffing goes, that's a budget issue, not a zoning text issue.
And I believe that we will be getting significant amounts of code enforcement in the near future. Yes, that's my thought. So we'll move beyond the code enforcement issue unless you have anything else. Did you like the event definition? That would only apply to event centers. So ease everyone, it may not be the same for the winery ordinance or anywhere else in the ordinance, only event centers.
Would you read that again, please, Troy?
I would read it to you again. Matter of fact, Kathy, can I give you some? You could pass these out. Thanks.
Oh, I just had one question on the last one. It's, can one event take place over multiple days? How are we?
Actually, I did not set it up that way. I set it up for 12 contiguous hours.
Okay.
I thought that was the absolute maximum that any one event would go, because you do have shut-off times at night and that sort of thing. So my intent was, like, the temporary outdoor event ordinance says that one temporary outdoor event can go over several days, a couple of days. I did not think that was appropriate in this instance. I thought what I had heard the commission indicate to me, that an event should take place during one business day that this is open, and that is an event. And then if it happens on Saturday, that's one event, and if it happens on Sunday, that's another event. That's what I heard. So when I went to write the definition of event, I put a gathering of more than 5 people for 1 to 12 hours where the purpose is for fundraising, profit, or is political, public, social, or educational in nature. So that means basically any gathering of people that's over five for more than an hour on an event center is construed to be an event. And then what I did put, because, you know, event center owners are like everyone else, especially agricultural event centers, a gathering which consists of friends or family of an event owner that is not for the purpose of fundraising, profit, or is political, public, or educational in nature, and no donation or compensation of any kind is exchanged in relationship to the gathering, is not considered an event. So if you have 50 of your best friends up on the 4th of July, and you just have them over, just like a lot of us have family gatherings at Christmas, and you have all those sorts of things, that would not be construed to be an event.
Now, if it's a family wedding, there's normally gifts associated with that?
I don't think that's in compensation for the event. I think that's giving a gift to the bride and groom.
Oh, okay.
Compensation is, the reason I wrote that way is, and I use an example, we've gotten complaints about an area, an event-like center, that they are saying to us that we have this, what would be like an event center, we only allow it to use friends, family, members of our congregation, and yes, we will accept donations in relationship to that use. Well, that to me is a loophole.
Right.
You know, that's not okay. If it's basically what this is meant to do is, like, if you're legitimately having a family gathering or a family wedding for your friends, and they're not giving you like a $5,000 donation to defray anything that might come up, no. That's what it's designed to stop.
Sounds good to me.
And I know there were some concerns on the 12 hours or whatever, but normally when something comes up, usually you put a time, like you can't start before 9 o'clock or 7 o'clock.
When I went back and looked at the ordinance, I think 12 hours will cover the gambit. I don't think it needs to go less or more than that. So are you okay with that? I mean,
yeah, because normally on any commercial enterprise, I mean, there's working hours or operational hours that we approve, because usually you have it in the conditional use permit.
And so, you know, this definition is directly targeted at agricultural event centers, because when you get to community centers and commercial event centers, which are also the other two definitions, those are just events specified by the use permit. And very well, a commercial event center, it would be like there is no limit on the number of events because you're in a general commercial area and it's understood that you may operate 24 hours a day. Any additions or subtractions to that event definition?
No, not for me.
Okay. I think I have everything. I will be back. The only thing that I need to come back to you, I can change everything in the ordinance if I understand this right. The only thing that you would like me to come back with is a few options with regard to the shared versus private road. Starting with what we have now, and then giving some options, maybe with performance standards and some other things of that nature.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So hopefully when we come back, we'll make a decision with regard to the roads, and then hopefully if you're comfortable with what we have, you'll make a recommendation based on the environmental document and the ordinance so we can go forward to the board.
And when is that coming back, do you think?
Well, I think the 30-day period, the first 30-day period on the environmental review document will end on the 7th, okay? And then we will look at what comments we received, see if we need to address any of those comments. Then we'll renotice it and send it out. I will probably make some modifications to reflect the changes that we've discussed here today. For the point of the environmental document, I will leave, because this would be the most concerning to people, I will leave for the environmental document that the road issue stays as is in the ordinance, because if you decided to do something more, it would be less of an impact to surrounding people. So in the sense of meeting the spirit of CEQA as being a disclosure document, I'll leave it at what would create the most impact or seemingly impact to people, the thing that people would be most concerned about, which is using a shared road. And if you decide to do something else, we're still covered in that document.
Yeah, in other words.
When do you think you're going to come back with the whole package?
Just to follow up on what George was saying, I mean, if we're going to be recirculating the neg deck, I mean, the soonest we can, get that out, get that recirculated, it would be probably the late June meeting if we're not in Tahoe. I would not anticipate us taking this one to Tahoe by any means. So depending on whether we go to Tahoe in June 12th or the 26th, it may actually be July when we come back.
Okay, late June or July. Okay, that's all I was asking. Just kind of curious when I think we'll be coming back.
Okay. Any other questions? Seeing none? Thank you so much for coming today. Really appreciate your input, on this, because you guys are the ones that really generated this document along with George. Thank you so much. With that, we'll close our meeting.
Nice stuff.